The garden hose was still running when Linda Whitmore stepped onto Vanessa Chen's front lawn without invitation, her white tennis shoes leaving impressions in the freshly watered grass. It was a Saturday morning in late June, the kind of Virginia summer day where the heat arrives early and stays late, and Vanessa had been watering the azaleas her father had helped her plant 3 weeks before he died. She looked up from the flower bed to see a woman in her mid-50s marching toward her with the determined stride of someone who'd appointed herself neighborhood enforcer and took the job. Linda's face was already flushed red, whether from the heat or anger Vanessa couldn't tell, and she was clutching a ring binder that Vanessa would later learn contained every HOA regulation ever written for the Meadowbrook Estates community. "Excuse me," Linda's voice cut through the peaceful morning like a car alarm. "I'm Linda Whitmore, HOA president, and you are in direct violation of community standards. Water restrictions are in effect, and you are not permitted to water landscaping between the hours of 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. I'm issuing you a citation, and if you don't turn off that hose immediately, I'll be forced to call the authorities." Vanessa stood slowly, her knees protesting after an hour of kneeling in the garden, and turned to face this stranger who just threatened her with police on her own property. She was wearing old jeans and a faded Georgetown Law t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, dirt under her fingernails from the planting. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman spending her Saturday morning trying to honor her late father's memory by keeping his azaleas alive. What she didn't look like, apparently, was someone Linda Whitmore thought deserved respect. If you're already feeling that familiar burn of injustice watching this scene unfold, then you're in exactly the right place. Hit that like button, because what happens next is the kind of instant karma that restores your faith in consequences. Share this with everyone who's ever dealt with a neighborhood bully who mistakes a title for actual authority. And subscribe to Acts of Depth, because we tell the stories about the exact moment when assumptions shatter, when power reveals itself, when the person being threatened turns out to be the absolute last person anyone should have underestimated. Now let me take you back to understand who Vanessa Chen really was, because that context makes what happens next even more satisfying. Vanessa Chen had been appointed director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation 6 months earlier, making her the first Asian American woman to hold the position in the agency's history. She'd spent 28 years working her way up through the ranks, starting as a field agent in the Los Angeles office fresh out of Georgetown Law, building cases against organized crime and public corruption that had put some of California's most powerful criminals behind bars. She was brilliant and relentless, the kind of investigator who saw patterns where others saw noise, who could sit in an interrogation room for 12 hours waiting for a suspect to make one tiny mistake that would crack their entire story. Her conviction rate was legendary. Her reputation for integrity was unimpeachable. And when the previous FBI director had retired under pressure following a series of scandals, the president had nominated Vanessa specifically because she represented everything the agency needed: competence, ethics, and a fresh perspective untainted by politics. The Senate had confirmed her 92-8. She now oversaw 35,000 employees, a budget in the billions, and investigations that ranged from terrorism to cybercrime to public corruption. She reported directly to the Attorney General and briefed the president weekly on national security threats. She had security clearance so high that most of what she knew couldn't be discussed outside of ses gifts, and she'd just bought a modest 4-bedroom house in Meadowbrook Estates because it was 20 minutes from FBI headquarters and had a backyard big enough for a garden. The house had been a compromise between security and normalcy. Vanessa's protective detail had wanted her in a gated community with controlled access points. She'd wanted a normal neighborhood where she could pretend for a few hours each weekend that she was just another person mowing her lawn and planting flowers. They'd settled on Meadowbrook Estates, a planned community in suburban Virginia with a homeowners association and covenants, and the kind of architectural uniformity that suggested everyone who lived there had agreed to prioritize property values over personality. Vanessa had bought the house in May, closed quickly using her maiden name Chen instead of her hyphenated married name to avoid immediate recognition, and had spent the past month slowly moving in between 14-hour days at the office. Her plan had been simple: keep a low profile, be a good neighbor, and create one space in her life where she wasn't Director Chen, but just Vanessa, A woman who liked gardening and mystery novels and Saturday mornings that didn't involve classified briefings. That plan had lasted exactly 4 weeks before Linda Whitmore appeared on her lawn, wielding HOA regulations like a weapon. Vanessa had dealt with cartel leaders and corrupt politicians and domestic terrorists who'd threatened to kill her and her family. But there was something uniquely exhausting about a suburban bully who'd confused homeowner association authority with actual power and had apparently never learned that position doesn't equal respect. Vanessa looked at Linda standing on her lawn, red-faced and self-righteous, clutching that binder like it was a holy text. "I wasn't aware of the water restrictions," she said calmly. "I just moved in a month ago and I haven't received the HOA regulations yet. If you'll send me a copy, I'll make sure to follow them." It was a reasonable response, a de-escalating response, the kind of response trained federal agents learned to give when dealing with people who were looking for conflict. But Linda wasn't interested in de-escalation. "Ignorance is not an excuse," she said, her voice rising. "Every homeowner receives a complete packet of regulations at closing. If you claim you didn't receive it, that's a problem with your realtor, not my concern. The citation stands. You'll receive a formal notice and a fine of $250 for the violation." Vanessa felt her jaw tighten. $250 for watering flowers on a Saturday morning. That seems excessive for a first offense that was clearly unintentional. Linda's eyes narrowed. "Are you arguing with me? Because I can make this citation for $300 if you'd like to continue being difficult. The HOA has full authority to enforce community standards, and we take violations seriously. If you can't follow the rules, perhaps you should consider whether this neighborhood is the right fit for you." The implication was clear. The threat was barely veiled, and Vanessa recognized the tactic immediately because she'd seen it 1,000 times in interrogation rooms and courtrooms. Escalate, intimidate, make the target feel powerless. Force compliance through fear of consequences. Vanessa had a choice in that moment. She could pull out her FBI credentials and watch Linda's face drain of color as she realized exactly who she was threatening. She could make a phone call and have her security detail here in 3 minutes to politely but firmly remove this woman from her property. She could use the power of her position to end this confrontation immediately and decisively. Or she could do what she'd learned to do over 28 years of dealing with bullies in positions of minor authority. Document everything, stay calm, and let them hang themselves with their own behavior. "I'll pay the fine," Vanessa said quietly, "and I'd appreciate receiving a copy of all HOA regulations so I can make sure this doesn't happen again." Linda smiled. It was the smile of someone who just won and knew it. "I'll have the regulations sent over, along with the citation. And Ms. Chen, a word of advice. Meadowbrook Estates has certain standards. We've worked hard to maintain the character of this community. Some people fit in here and some don't. I suggest you think carefully about whether you're the former or the latter." She turned and walked off Vanessa's lawn, her white tennis shoes leaving a trail through the wet grass, supremely confident that she'd just put an uppity newcomer in her place. Vanessa stood watching her go, the garden hose still running at her feet, and thought about all the criminals she'd helped convict who'd had that same confidence right up until the moment the jury foreman read the verdict. The citation arrived by certified mail 3 days later, along with a 47-page packet of HOA regulations that read like they'd been written by someone who'd confused residential community management with running a maximum security prison. No parking on streets overnight. No lawn ornaments except approved seasonal decorations. No exterior paint colors except from a pre-approved palette. No noise after 9 p.m. No visible garbage cans except on collection days. No basketball hoops. No playground equipment. No vegetable gardens in front yards. No clotheslines. No fences above 4 feet. No sheds visible from the street. The list went on, each rule more petty than the last, all of them enforced by Linda Whitmore and her HOA board with the zealotry of true believers. Vanessa read through the regulations while eating dinner alone in her kitchen, and she started to understand something troubling. This wasn't about maintaining property values. This was about control, about creating a community where certain people felt empowered to police other people's behavior, about using rules as weapons against anyone who didn't fit someone's narrow vision of who belonged. She'd seen it before in her work. Not in suburban HOAS, but in corrupt police departments and discriminatory lending practices and voter suppression schemes. Systems that looked neutral on paper but operated with bias in practice. And she recognized the pattern because catching patterns was what she did for a living. Over the next 3 weeks, Vanessa received 4 more citations from the HOA. One for her garbage cans being visible from the street 15 minutes past the allowed collection day window. One for a small decorative garden flag that apparently violated the seasonal decoration policy. One for parking her personal car on the street overnight when her garage was being used to store moving boxes. And one for her grass being a 1/4 inch above the maximum allowed height. Each citation came with a fine ranging from $100 to $300. Each one was delivered by Linda Whitmore personally, always with that same smug smile and thinly veiled suggestions that perhaps Vanessa should consider moving somewhere more suitable for her. Vanessa paid each fine without argument and documented everything. She photographed the violations. She kept copies of all citations. She reviewed the HOA regulations and compared them to Virginia state law governing homeowners associations. And she started asking quiet questions of her neighbors, knocking on doors on Saturday afternoons and introducing herself, asking how long they'd lived in Meadowbrook Estates and whether they'd had any issues with the HOA. What she discovered was illuminating and depressing in equal measure. Linda Whitmore had been HOA president for 8 years. In that time, she'd issued over 300 citations to homeowners. But the distribution wasn't random. White families who'd lived in the community for years rarely received citations. New residents, particularly those who weren't white, received them constantly. One Indian American family had been cited 12 times in their first 6 months. A black family had been cited for having a basketball hoop, while 3 white families with identical hoops had never been cited once. An Asian couple had been cited for their lawn being too short, then too long, then too short again within the same month. The pattern was undeniable. Linda Whitmore wasn't enforcing HOA regulations. She was using them as tools of harassment to make certain residents feel unwelcome. And Meadowbrook Estates had slowly transformed from a diverse community into an increasingly homogeneous one, as families of color got tired of the constant citations and moved away. Vanessa had prosecuted civil rights cases before. She knew what housing discrimination looked like. She knew the difference between neutral enforcement of rules and selective enforcement designed to exclude. And she knew that what Linda Whitmore was doing was potentially illegal under the Fair Housing Act. But Vanessa also knew that individual complaints rarely changed systemic problems. You needed documentation. You needed patterns. You needed evidence so overwhelming that the defense fell apart under its own weight. So she kept paying the fines, kept documenting, kept gathering evidence. And she waited for Linda to make the mistake that all bullies eventually make, pushing too far against someone who wouldn't be pushed. That moment came on a Tuesday afternoon in late July when Vanessa was sitting on her front porch reading a book, enjoying an hour of peace before heading back to the office for an evening briefing. Linda's car pulled into Vanessa's driveway, blocking her in, and Linda emerged with her binder and her righteous anger and a new citation. "You're in violation of the guest parking policy," Linda announced. "You had a car parked in your driveway for more than 3 consecutive days last week. Guest parking is limited to 48 hours. The fine is $400. Vanessa looked up from her book. The car in question had belonged to her sister who'd visited for a long weekend. "My sister was staying with me. She's family, not a guest. And she was only here for 3 days, which is barely over the limit." Linda's smile was razor sharp. "The regulation makes no distinction between family and guests. Overnight parking by non-residents is limited to 48 hours. You violated that limit. The fine stands." Vanessa set down her book. "This is harassment, Ms. Whitmore. You've issued me 9 citations in 6 weeks. I've spoken to other residents and the pattern is clear. You selectively enforce these regulations against certain home owners while ignoring identical behavior from others. That's not community management. That's discrimination." Linda's face flushed darker. "Are you accusing me of racism? Because I can assure you the HOA enforces all regulations equally. If you're receiving more citations than other residents, perhaps you should consider that you're violating more rules. Some people respect community standards. Others think the rules don't apply to them." The implication was clear. The racism was barely coded. and Vanessa had heard enough. I want to see the citation records for all homeowners for the past 2 years. The HOA is required to maintain those records and make them available to residents upon request. I'm formally requesting them now. Linda's expression shifted from smug to furious. You have no right to demand anything. I'm the HOA president, and I decide what records are shared and with whom. If you don't like how this community is run, you're free to sell your house and leave. Vanessa stood up slowly, her book forgotten on the porch chair. Actually, as a resident and HOA member, I have every legal right to request those records under Virginia state law. Your refusal to provide them is a violation of that law. So let me be very clear. You will provide those records within 7 business days as required by statute, or I will take legal action to compel their production. Do you understand? Linda stepped closer, her voice dropping to a hiss. You think you can threaten me? I've been running this HOA for 8 years. I've dealt with troublemakers before. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I can make your life miserable. I can fine you into bankruptcy. I can make sure you regret ever moving to this neighborhood. So back down, or you'll regret it. It was a direct threat, witnessed by 2 neighbors who were working in their yards and had stopped to watch the confrontation. Recorded by Vanessa's doorbell camera that captured everything, and it was the final piece of evidence Vanessa needed. She pulled her phone from her pocket and made a call. Agent Morrison, this is Director Chen. I need you to send a team to my residence immediately. I have a situation that requires documentation. She ended the call and looked at Linda, whose face had gone from red to pale. You should probably stay right where you are. The FBI will want to speak with you. Linda laughed, a nervous, disbelieving laugh. The FBI? You're calling the FBI over an HOA dispute? That's insane. They won't even take your call seriously. You can't just... She stopped mid-sentence as 3 black SUVs pulled onto the street and 6 FBI agents in suits and tactical gear emerged and walked up Vanessa's driveway. The lead agent was a woman in her 40s named Sarah Morrison, who'd worked on Vanessa's protective detail for 3 years. She approached with the kind of crisp professionalism that suggested this was just another day at the office. Director Chen, you called for assistance? Vanessa nodded toward Linda, who was standing frozen with her binder clutched to her chest like a shield. Agent Morrison, this is Linda Whitmore, president of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA. Ms. Whitmore has been conducting what appears to be a systematic campaign of harassment against minority homeowners in this community, using selective enforcement of HOA regulations to make them feel unwelcome. She's issued me 9 citations in 6 weeks, has refused to provide legally required documentation, and just moments ago made direct threats against me. I'd like you to document this interaction and collect evidence of the pattern of discrimination. Linda's mouth opened and closed without sound. Her eyes moved from Morrison to the other agents to Vanessa, and the calculation happening behind them was almost visible. Director Chen, FBI agents calling Vanessa director. The impossible reality that she just threatened the director of the FBI while being recorded and witnessed. Morrison pulled out a notebook. Ms. Whitmore, I'm going to need you to provide your full contact information and any documentation related to citations you've issued to residents of this community. We'll also need access to all HOA records, including meeting minutes, enforcement actions, and financial documents. You can cooperate voluntarily or we can obtain a warrant. Which would you prefer? Linda found her voice finally, though it came out as a whisper. You're the FBI director? Vanessa nodded. I am. I've been director for 6 months. Before that, I was assistant director of the Criminal Investigative Division. Before that, special agent in charge of the Los Angeles field office. I've spent 28 years with the Bureau investigating public corruption, civil rights violations, and I've been documenting what appears to be a clear pattern of housing discrimination in this community, facilitated by your selective enforcement of HOA regulations. She gestured to Morrison. Agent Morrison will be conducting a preliminary investigation. If the evidence supports what I've observed, this will be referred to the Civil Rights Division for a full investigation and potential prosecution under the Fair Housing Act. I'd suggest you cooperate fully. Linda's face had gone gray. The binder slipped from her hands and hit the driveway, pages scattering. I didn't know. I wasn't. This is a misunderstanding. I enforced the rules equally. I was just doing my job. Vanessa's expression didn't change. You told me 10 minutes ago that you could find me into bankruptcy and make me regret living here. You've issued over 300 citations in 8 years with a clear pattern of targeting minority residents. You've created a hostile environment designed to force certain people out of this community. That's not doing your job. That's violating federal civil rights law. And the fact that you didn't know I was the FBI director doesn't change what you did. It just means you felt comfortable doing it to someone you thought couldn't fight back. The investigation took 3 weeks. FBI agents interviewed every resident of Meadowbrook Estates. They reviewed 8 years of HOA records, citation patterns, meeting minutes, and email communications. They analyzed the data statistically, comparing citation rates across demographic groups. And what they found was exactly what Vanessa had documented on her own. Linda Whitmore had issued citations to minority residents at a rate 14 times higher than white residents. She'd selectively enforced regulations against families of color while ignoring identical violations by white families. Her emails to other HOA board members included explicitly racist language discussing the need to maintain standards and preserve the character of the community, phrases that were thinly veiled code for keeping out non-white residents. She'd even conspired with a local realtor to discourage minority buyers from purchasing homes in Meadowbrook Estates. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The Civil Rights Division filed charges against Linda Whitmore and the HOA board for systematic violations of the Fair Housing Act. The case never went to trial. Linda's attorney took one look at the evidence and advised her to plead guilty in exchange for a recommendation of probation instead of prison time. She was fined $50,000, banned from serving on any HOA board in Virginia, and required to complete 200 hours of community service with a fair housing advocacy organization. The HOA itself was placed under federal monitoring for 3 years, required to implement non-discriminatory enforcement policies, and forced to refund every citation issued to minority residents over the past 5 years. The total cost to the HOA was over $200,000 in refunds and legal fees. But Vanessa's goal hadn't been punishment. It had been change. She worked with the new HOA board to rewrite the regulations, eliminating the petty rules that had been weaponized against residents and focusing instead on legitimate community maintenance. She helped recruit a diverse board that actually represented the demographics of Meadowbrook Estates, and she started a neighborhood association separate from the HOA that focused on building community instead of enforcing compliance. Within 6 months, the culture of Meadowbrook Estates had transformed. Families who'd been driven out by Linda's harassment started moving back. New residents who'd avoided the community because of its reputation began buying homes there. And the property values that Linda had claimed to be protecting through her discrimination actually increased because people wanted to live in a community that was welcoming instead of hostile. Vanessa kept the house. She planted more azaleas in her father's memory, this time without worrying about water restriction violations. She joined the neighborhood book club and hosted summer barbecues and became the kind of neighbor she'd always wanted to be. Present, engaged, and part of a community instead of just living in proximity to one. And every time she worked in her garden, every time she watered those azaleas her father had helped plant, she thought about the lesson Linda Whitmore had learned the hard way. Power isn't about position, it's about integrity. Authority isn't about control, it's about service. And the person you're threatening might be exactly the wrong person to underestimate. Linda Whitmore sold her house in Meadowbrook Estates 4 months after the settlement and moved to a different county. Her real estate license was suspended for 6 months due to her involvement in the discrimination scheme. Her reputation in Virginia HOA circles was destroyed, and she became a cautionary tale that Vanessa used when she spoke at community forums about fair housing. Not to humiliate Linda, but to illustrate how systems of minor power could be corrupted into tools of discrimination if nobody was paying attention. Vanessa's father had been an FBI agent in the 70s and 80s, one of the first Chinese-American agents in the Bureau's history. He'd faced discrimination his entire career. Colleagues who doubted his loyalty because of his ethnicity, supervisors who passed him over for promotions he'd earned. But he'd never quit, never backed down, never accepted that prejudice was just the way things were. He taught Vanessa that excellence was necessary but not sufficient, that you had to combine competence with courage, that standing up to injustice wasn't optional for people who had the power to make a difference. The azaleas were his favorite flower. He'd grown them in every yard they'd lived in during Vanessa's childhood, carefully tending them through seasons and moves and the chaos of a life in law enforcement. When he'd helped her plant them in her new yard 3 weeks before the heart attack that killed him, he'd said something she'd been thinking about a lot lately. These flowers take time to establish. They need good soil and regular care and patience. But once they take root, they're stronger than they look. They survive winters. They come back year after year. They bloom when the conditions are right. Vanessa stood in her garden on a Saturday morning 2 years after Linda Whitmore had first stepped onto her lawn with threats and citations and barely concealed racism. The azaleas were blooming now, bright pink and white flowers covering the bushes her father had helped plant. The garden he'd envisioned was flourishing, and the community that Linda had tried to keep homogeneous and controlled had become something better. Diverse, welcoming, and genuinely connected. Vanessa's doorbell rang and she looked up to see one of her neighbors, a young black family who'd moved in 6 months ago, standing on her porch holding a plate of cookies. "We just wanted to say thank you," the wife said when Vanessa answered the door. "We almost didn't buy a house here because we'd heard about the HOA problems. But our realtor told us about what you did, how you changed things. This is the first place we've lived where we actually feel welcome, where our kids can play outside without someone calling the cops on them, where we're just neighbors instead of problems to be managed. So thank you." Vanessa accepted the cookies and invited them to stay for coffee, and they sat on her porch talking about schools and weekend plans and the book club meeting next week. Normal conversation, neighbor conversation, the kind of interaction that should be unremarkable but felt revolutionary in a community that had spent years being poisoned by someone who'd confused authority with power and compliance with respect. If you've stayed with this story to the end, you understand something crucial about justice and power and the importance of standing up even when it would be easier to walk away. Vanessa Chen could have moved, could have paid the fines and found a different neighborhood where she wouldn't be harassed, could have used her position to destroy Linda Whitmore personally instead of addressing the systemic problem that enabled her discrimination. But she chose the harder path. She documented everything, built an airtight case, used her power not for revenge, but for transformation. And she changed an entire community in the process. Share this story with everyone who's ever dealt with a HOA bully, a neighborhood enforcer, or anyone who's confused a title with actual authority. Subscribe to Acts of Depth because we'll keep telling stories about the moment when the underestimated reveal their power, when assumptions crash into reality, when justice arrives not as revenge, but as systemic change. Linda Whitmore thought she was threatening a newcomer who couldn't fight back. She had no idea she was threatening the director of the FBI, who'd spent nearly 3 decades building cases against people exactly like her. That miscalculation cost Linda her position, her reputation, and her ability to ever wield that kind of petty power again. But the real story isn't about Linda's downfall. It's about Vanessa's refusal to let discrimination define her community. It's about using power to protect others, not just yourself. It's about the long, patient work of changing systems instead of just winning individual battles. The azaleas her father planted are blooming now. They survived the winter. They came back stronger. And in a garden that was meant to be a memorial, Vanessa built something living. Proof that communities can change, that justice can be more than punishment, that the person watering flowers on a Saturday morning